Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name's Joe Farrar. I'm Senior Vice President, Chief of Staff here at Georgetown. And it's wonderful to welcome all of you to our conversation tonight. This is part of our series on faith and culture. And our distinguished guest tonight is the author Ayana Mathis. I'm here today on behalf of the President's Office at Georgetown. And I'd like to thank Paul Elie, the curator of our series, as well as the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice for partnering with us on this gathering this evening. Since 2008, this lecture series has sought to deepen opportunities for dialogue at the intersection of faith, culture, and society. Paul Elie, who is a senior fellow at our Berkley Center and the director of our American Pilgrimage Project, has guided us over all this time. We're deeply grateful for all that Paul has done to make this series what it is. Over nearly 2 decades now, the Faith and Culture series has welcomed a broad range of writers and thinkers. These have included the filmmaker Martin Scorsese, novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the biographer Jonathan Iga, poets Christian Wyman and Tracy K. Smith, and just last semester, journalist and author Eliza Griswold. This afternoon, we're grateful to welcome back to Georgetown acclaimed novelist and essayist Ayana Mathis. Ayana is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, one of the oldest and most prestigious graduate creative writing programs in the country. While there, she studied under Marilynne Robinson, someone who we had the opportunity to host as one of the earliest guests of this series, the Faith and Culture series. That was back in 2009. Ayana later taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop and is now a distinguished lecturer at Hunter College, as well as one of the current Hodder Fellows at Princeton University. Her writing has appeared in a number of newspapers and magazines, including The Atlantic, the Financial Times, and Rolling Stone. Last year, she completed a 5-part essay series in the New York Times entitled Imprinted by Belief that considers how the Christian faith has influenced and shaped American literature. She is also the author of 2 critically acclaimed novels. Her first, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, was published in 2012 and quickly became a New York Times bestseller. Selected as the second installment in Oprah's Book Club 2.0, the work follows the journeys of a Black matriarch and her children and grandchildren during the Great Migration. It has been translated into 16 languages since its publication. In 2023, she released The Unsettled, a novel that moves between Philadelphia and a disappearing community in Alabama, as it explores questions of estrangement, grief, and cultural survival across generations. Ayana has described The Unsettled as, quote, a novel of hope. Her characters navigate extraordinary challenges, including poverty, racism, and violence. And yet, these characters also strongly believe that, as Ayana has explained, quote, tomorrow can be better than today, and they risk everything to make that so. Ayana centers questions of faith, religion, and spirituality in her novels, a perspective that is deepened by her own upbringing and by her current work as a Master of Divinity student at Union Theological. Reflecting on how these themes inform her creative process, Ayana has said, and let me quote, belief entails that you think a human being is an incredible thing, incredibly awful, incredibly awesome, in the truest sense of the word. That is always a check against superficial, flat characters, against reducing people or their ideas. Human beings are capacious and massive, massively awful, massively wonderful, massively confounding, but massive. Throughout her writing, Ayana brings forward these complex questions at the intersection of faith, culture, and society, and invites us to engage them ever more deeply in this moment. Ayana, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for sharing your insights and reflections with us. And let me now also introduce our distinguished author, editor, and member of our community, Paul Elie, who will be facilitating tonight's conversation with Ayana Mathis. Paul has facilitated this series, as I've said, since its inception now almost 20 years ago. Paul is the author of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, a portrait of 4 20th century Catholic writers, which won the Penn Martha Allbrand Award for First Nonfiction, and another book, Reinventing Bach. Both of these books were National Book Critics Circle Award finalists. His third book, The Last Supper, which I'm pleased to say I have just recently read, which considers the intersection of religion and the arts in the 1980s, will be published next month. And we look forward to gathering here once again in just a few weeks on April 29th to celebrate Paul's newest book. So I hope you can all join us for that. Paul is also a regular contributor to The New Yorker, which has published many of his writings on topics such as Catholicism, the Vatican, and Pope Francis. Paul, thank you so much for leading us this afternoon. Ayana, thank you again for being here, and I will now get out of the way and let the conversation start. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
You were here a few years ago, an age ago, though, it feels like.
Yeah.
Benedict was Pope, Obama was president, and we undertook with the Vatican this project called the Courtyard of the Gentiles, which was an outward-facing project awkwardly named that Benedict had initiated. And we had a kind of arts festival here. And you were here with the poet laureate Robert Pinsky and a student and Cardinal Rabasi from the Dicastery for Culture at the Vatican. And the 12 Tribes of Hattie had just been published, your first book. Then years passed and we waited for another book.
Many years.
Yeah, but but that's kind of my first question. I'm on the 10-year plan myself. I take a long time writing a book. And the question is whether you're going to get it, whether it's going to go. But once it's going and once it's done, the time feels necessary and even natural for me anyway. It doesn't make my family happy, but how about for you? I mean, what's that like to have 12 Tribes of Hattie come out and then the Unsettled about a decade later?
It was, I think for a long time after Hattie, because it had the sort of great fortunes that it had, it took me a long time to recapture the things that you need to write anything, like privacy and your own discernment and a sort of quietness inside of the mind. So for a long time, I kind of couldn't regain any of that. And so there were a few years spent just sort of trying and kind of floundering around with paragraphs that didn't go anywhere and really having lost an ability to assess them in any way. It's sort of like I would sit down to write and then write a few sentences or whatever, and then instead of my own voice and my own kind of sense of discernment saying, oh, this is going somewhere and this isn't, it would be like the New York Times was like, there's too many adjectives in that. Like, why are these people talking so much? So it took a long time to kind of quiet all of those voices. And then once that happened, I thought it would be better. I was like, okay, well, this is great. At least I can start now, whatever. And then this book just was a real SOB. It just really, it was just, I think sometimes books sort of gel. You can get to a point where you gain momentum, and then you sort of got the wind at your back, and it's sort of pushing you forward. And I kept waiting for that to happen with The Unsettled, and it just sort of didn't. It just was kind of a fight from start to finish. And so it took the time it took, because I think and I'm glad it did. You know, I mean, I'm proud of the book. I think it's a better book. So that means I'm doing my job to some extent, I hope, right? Then if my job is to kind of develop and become a more deeply thinking person, which I think is my job, then this book is successful in that way. But certainly it was just a book that was very resistant. I'll put it that way.
Well, your account of that's a very high-minded account of what can take a writer so long. I worked with Tom Wolfe when I worked at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and he, after his success with The Bonfire of the Vanities, he went to every foreign land for the publication of its edition, and it was written into his contract. This was the early 90s, that he had to travel on the Concorde.
Oh, wow.
So that was his problem. He was jetting around on the Concorde too much.
Exactly.
So your struggles were a lot more.
I wish that had been my problem. That would have been way better.
But then, and I'm just thinking of this now, so it may be a wild idea, but could it have to do with the dynamisms of the two books? The 12 Tribes of Hattie is to sketch it in broad strokes, about people who go out diasporically from an intact Christian community, whereas the Unsettled is people starting at a place of loss and dislocation and finding their way towards something that's of greater rootedness, I guess. And what you just said suggests that you had to kind of find your way there yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I think one of the things about this book that was so difficult was, the early half of the book, the first half of the book, more or less, takes place in Philadelphia in the 1980s. That's the setting, half in Philadelphia, half in a little fictional town in a bend in the river in Alabama called Bonaparte. But the Philadelphia sections more or less entirely take place in a homeless shelter for the first half of the book. And so that kind of, it's both rootlessness and instability and stasis, right? Like she's sort of stuck, these characters are kind of stuck in their rootlessness and their stasis. So part of the difficulty there was trying to render a static rootlessness dynamic, and to figure out exactly what it was that these folks were looking for. You know, I mean, books come to you in a strange order, kind of, you know. So I knew fairly early on that they were going to be in this shelter, and I didn't know for how much of the book they would be there, but I knew that they would. And so then you sort of have the reverse problem of figuring out how to make that dynamic, what they're doing there, what they're looking for, what they're coming from, what they might be heading toward. And certainly, I think Ava, the main character, there's three main characters really. Ava, her mother, Duchess, who's in Alabama, and her son, whose name is Toussaint. And, you know, Ava has come from this dynamic community of Bonaparte, which by the time we meet it, it is sort of fading. But it sort of has its own religious ethos. It has its own, it's very particular. It's very much a place, you know. She leaves there for various reasons that I won't get into trying to talk around spoilers, and finds herself in Philadelphia. And essentially she's kind of looking to recreate something like that place, but without the sort of traumas of having had to leave the place. And so some of that's just her own character, some of it's political in many ways, and some of it also certainly is spiritual. Like there's this sort of centeredness that Bonaparte had, this place that she's left, that she can't find. And she can't find it in Philadelphia, she can't find it in herself. But the interesting thing, I think, in some ways, is that she at least has some kind of connection to the rooted sort of spiritual realities of the place that she comes from. Her son, Toussaint, is born in Philadelphia in the north, so he doesn't even have that. He's sort of like the furthest removed, you know, if there was a sort of spectrum of rootlessness in the book, right? Duchess, the mother in Alabama, would be the most rooted, and then Ava is in this kind of chooses to uproot herself, so she's in a sort of weird limbo. And then there's this son, Toussaint, this kid, who is absolutely sort of the most rootless of the three, never having really known where he comes from. He's never been there. He doesn't know his grandmother. He doesn't know anything about, except in myth, these things that are very much a part of his legacy. And it makes me think a little bit of some of the stuff we've been talking about, this sense of a kind of general declining religiosity, right? Or sort of familiarity with certain things like this. And he's in a way, he's kind of an embodiment of that sort of thing.
And you can really feel it reading the book. In the 12 Tribes of Hattie, people responded to that book for so many reasons: the lyricism, the scope in a relatively compact book, the ebullience, the energy, but also the sense of religion alive and near at hand. When people in that book refer to Daniel in the lion's den, it's like he's their neighbor. They're really conversant with this tradition. And suddenly in the Unsettled, we're at a homeless shelter where there's just 7 shades of bureaucracy and no humanity at all. But then the characters find their way back through various forms of what seemed to me improvised or do-it-yourself religion, which, when we were talking outside, you said that it wasn't picked up on nearly to the extent that you would have expected. So what do those reviewers miss that you can then emphasize now about what was reconstituted for these characters and the kind of crypto-religiosity of it?
I think before I actually answer the question, it's very interesting to me, and maybe it's a part of the answer to the question. It's interesting to me how much in contemporary literature, unless a writer has sort of declared themselves or been declared explicitly a religious writer, very religious aspects of their work go largely unremarked in critical engagement. It's very interesting to me, and it happens over and over again. And certainly I think with both of my books, that is religiosity, or the religiosity of the characters, has been something that is hardly mentioned at all, hardly mentioned in reviews, hardly. And I find that really interesting. And I don't know if that's about a certain kind of growing skepticism about whether or not religiosity is a legitimate form of inquiry, like maybe,
That's part of it.
Exactly, right? And sometimes I think the other thing that happens, particularly with writers of color, is that sometimes critical engagement is so focused on identity that it fails to sort of recognize other aspects of the work, which I find annoying. So there's all of that. Specifically to the characters now, really to your question. I think one of the things that I wanted to be able to think about in this book is a kind of multiplicity of African American religious experience. Like in Bonaparte, this little kind of town in the bend in the Alabama River, it's a black settlement. It's been there for a long, long time, though, again, when we meet it, it's very much in decline. But there they have a kind of syncretized religion, which is kind of Christianity blended with reverence for the natural world and things like that. They don't generally call God in that term, even though that's who they're referring to. They call God the everlasting. There's a lot of it's sort of it's doing kind of a different sort of thing. It's syncretized, really, I think. So that's what's happening in Alabama. And then in the Philadelphia sections, you have Ava, whose arrival at the shelter is essentially occasioned by a marriage that she basically blew up. She's married to a horrible guy. He's horrible. But she's also a self-saboteur, so she kind of blows this marriage up. But this guy is a kind of more of an evangelical type, I think, who very much kind of weaponizes his belief, right? He uses as a cudgel, really. So we've got that representation, and then there's Toussaint, who sort of doesn't really know quite what to believe, but has found some comfort in this kind of evangelical world of his stepfather. Then there's a character named Cass, who is how do you describe Cass? He's like a Black Panther cult leader or something. He's difficult to describe. He's
Messianic in his way, though.
Yes, absolutely. And who is, I think, entirely an atheist, right? He is a former Black Panther. He's a doctor. He's kind of a Marxist, I think, actually. But he understands that being conversant in the language of a certain kind of Christianity is very, very appealing. And so he also sort of uses it to kind of gather followers and sort of bring people into the fold. And then you have a character named Pastor Phil, who we've been talking about a bit, who's an Episcopalian priest, you know. So and she's very much a force for good and a kind of a positive presence in the novel. But so all of these things together, you know, you get this kind of, I hope, this sort of very faceted, certainly not thorough by any means, but a kind of faceted idea of the very many manifestations of African American religiosity, which I think often gets limited just to like the Black church, kind of whatever that is. Which you know what I mean? Like that even that term is kind of like we could associate it with some things, but it certainly isn't thorough, really. So often African American religiosity is kind of reduced to that, where you get, you know, kind of a little bit of talk about kind of slave religion, things like that. But there's not a lot of exploration of this sort of how broad it is and how different it is and how faceted it is, and that there are atheists and true believers and people on every spectrum in between. So I was really kind of wanting to think about those things and explore those things in this novel.
Well, it really works in the terms that you describe, but it's not at all programmatic. These people are just walking and talking.
Yeah, they're just.
And especially Pastor Phil. I mean, let's hear it from Pastor Phil.
Okay.
You have her at hand.
I do. We were talking about Paul and I were talking about how on this subject of religion in both my novels rarely making it into the pages of the paper. I have a favorite one of my favorite characters is this character named Pastor Phil, who Philomena, and that everybody in the neighborhood just calls her Pastor Phil. And she's got this sort of, I always imagine a very fledgling little Episcopalian congregation. And people kind of, you know, she's in a Black neighborhood in the 80s, so people kind of think she's sort of like the wrong religion. Like people are like, well, what even is that? You know, like they kind of want her to be Baptist or something, but she's not. So she's this very, you know, but she's this very unusual, deeply compassionate figure. She's sort of the Jesus figure in a certain way to me.
And unusual because she chain smokes.
Yeah, and she has and she's very funny. So here's just a little paragraph. This is a conversation. Toussaint and Pastor Phil are having a conversation. She becomes a confidant to him because his family eventually sort of gets caught up in this kind of cult-like situation, and their house gets raided by the police, and this kid is really, he doesn't really have anyone to trust. You know, his mother has sort of receded into the kind of cultish environment in which they live. His father's a mess, etc. So he's become friends with Pastor Phil, who's friends with lots of kids in the neighborhood. He goes and talks to her in the middle of the night. She's always kind of chain smoking and hanging out on her porch, drinking Cokes and whatever, lures the kids in, etc. So anyway, they're talking on her porch steps of the rectory, really. Pastor Phil sat facing him on the porch steps. She looked him right in the eye, always. That's why he ended up telling her things he didn't mean to tell, like now. And then you came, he said. He's referring to her coming to help them after this police raid in their home. Pastor Phil nodded. Her eyes were very bright, maybe crying bright, so she lit another cigarette. Pastor Phil was always smoking, which was a thing ministers weren't supposed to do. And she kind of talked to herself when she forgot you were in the room. And she was always on the porch looking out at the street. Plus, she ate all her meals outside, and all of them were sandwiches. When anybody she knew passed by, she waved her hoagie at them like she'd forgotten it was in her hand. Good afternoon, Mrs. Morris. Good afternoon, Mr. Peoples. Pastor Phil talked like she was in a black and white movie. She never cussed. How come you only eat standing in doorways? Toussaint asked. Oh, do I? I guess I never really got a good domestic sense of things. She laughed. I'm like a squirrel or something that doesn't quite belong indoors. I don't much like cooking or anything like that. My mom neither, Toussaint said. No, I suppose not, she said.
And at this cult commune, they're all creedal vegetarians, so the kids come over to get some ham sandwiches.
She's got ham sandwiches. She's got like all the contraband
Coke.
foods. Yeah.
Joe mentioned that Marilyn Robinson's been a guest of ours, and it's to me staggering to think that you could be a student of Marilyn Robinson's. Like that's like studying with Milton or something. What is that like?
I don't know. You know, I mean, an incredible gift. She was my. I'll tell a story. She's become a mentor figure and a really dear friend of mine. And then I think that was mostly because, you know, people would go and talk to her all the time, but, you know, it's Marilyn Robinson, so everyone's like, Marilyn, and, you know. And I would just sort of go to her office and, like, crack jokes. And she was like, what's wrong with this one? And so we just sort of became, you know, I just kind of became friends. But here's the story I'll tell. When I was, my first book, Hattie, I wrote when I was in grad school. I was at Iowa. And I had applied to the workshop with some material that I later abandoned because it wasn't working. Marilyn was my first instructor when I was a student there. And I remember I had put up for workshopping this thing that wasn't working. And I knew it wasn't working, but I didn't have anything else, and I didn't know what else to do with, you know, I was sort of stuck about it.
Deadline comes and you got to submit.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and I was like, well, you know, this is all I've got, and I have no idea what else to do, and maybe I can fix it, and it'll be okay, you know. And so we're in workshop, and my fellow students are kind of talking, and, you know, the comments are fine, and I'm like, okay, well, you know, maybe everything's going to be okay. It's all going to be fine, and then Marilyn says, sort of from the front of the room, she says, as if in mid-thought, she says, well, it is true that the characters are not sufficiently complex to the situation in which you've placed them. God only knows what she was thinking like before that. I shudder to think. I've never asked her. I probably should. I don't know if she'd remember. But so then, of course, I cried for 3 weeks. Like, kidding, like in the shower. Like I would just like be showering and I'd be like, what am I doing here? And then I started Hattie. So, you know, she was absolutely right, and thank God the whole thing happened. But yeah, it was a rough one.
And now you were a colleague of hers, and then, I mean, does she, you know, quote from Calvin when at faculty suppers, or?
She doesn't at the faculty suppers, no. But she, you know, she's actually a very funny woman, which is a thing that people, I think, sometimes don't know about her. She's quite funny. She makes lots of jokes and she laughs easily, and she's a very generous soul.
I love her, and I'm having a little fun at her expense, but this is one of the great, you know, geniuses of our time.
Really.
And what you said earlier about the perception of religiosity in books. Mm-hmm. Her first book, Housekeeping, when I read it in the mid-'80s, my first thought was, wow, this is biblical.
Yeah.
But it was not presented as such. It was presented as dirty realism along the lines of Carver and Ford.
Which is
because
so
it was
bizarre if you've
far
read
west,
Housekeeping. Yeah, but it's not.
Small town folks. But then when she kind of came out as a person committed to Christianity, then that's been the read on her work. Mm-hmm. But at the time, it wasn't. Yeah. But it's there in the cadences and the almost like 7 days of creation with which the book opens.
Yeah.
So that perception is so much, I guess, in this realm. But the perception that attached itself to your work or that didn't was then, you know, substantially altered by this, I guess, 5-part, 10,000 word series that you did for the New York Times, Imprinted by Belief. How did that come about? You went to them, or they came to you, or?
I was incredibly fortuitous. So I went through a period in which I was writing a lot of book reviews for the New York Times, and which I really enjoyed doing. And Pamela Paul was the was running the book review at that time, and she sent me an email and said, "Hey, I have this kind of weird idea. I don't know if you know." And so we met up for coffee, and she was like, "I don't know anything about God. I don't know. But but people are kind of interested in this sort of thing. Like, would you think about like talking about the God stuff in some books?" And she was like, you could do whatever you want, like however you want to shape it, whatever you want to include, whatever structure. And so I was like, yeah. I also was sort of like, I'm the least qualified person on earth to possibly do this. So between intimidation and kind of life, it was not until about a year after that, and she had left the book review by that time, that we actually maybe it was a year and a half maybe after that. So it was her, it was sort of her idea, but she was really incredibly generous in allowing me to kind of shape it and structure it however I wanted to. And what ended up happening was that the series sort of took on almost like a kind of, each essay is shaped around an existential / theological category, broadly speaking.
Forgiveness, evil, and apocalypse at the end times, right?
Yeah. And so, and then each of those, I would sort of think about the purpose of the series in a certain way, which I don't know if it was what Pamela Paul had in mind, but it seemed very important to me, is that you were sort of in this period of, we're probably all familiar with the Pew Study and the nuns and the whole thing. Sort of declining religiosity, declining affiliation with religious groups, all of that kind of stuff. And so one of the concerns to me about that is that we're sort of swimming in the ether is in the West, particularly in the United States. All of these Christian and Christian-inflected ideas are sort of all around us, for better and for worse. And that is not in any way a kind of claim of the supremacy of Christianity above any other religion, but rather, since it is the religion of the founders, it's just, here it is. And so much of everything about American society, from our politics to our art, to on and on and on, is sort of inflected by these ideas. And sometimes it's inflected by these ideas very much to our detriment, sometimes very much to our good. But if this stuff kind of begins to become unrecognizable to folks, then how do we salvage what's useful to us, and how do we critique or jettison what isn't? And so that was kind of the overarching idea in my mind. And since I'm a writer and I read a lot, I thought that maybe the best way to do this would be to think about it sort of through literature and what literature is doing, in particular contemporary literature. Because as I was saying, we were sort of making a joke about it, but so often, unless someone is explicit, like in the case of Marilyn or whoever, unless someone is explicitly labeled a religious writer, we sort of miss everything that might be there that is in fact religious material. And so I really wanted to be able to think about that more and explore that stuff much more thoroughly. Also because I think there are ways in which we have these received notions that are calcified and unexamined. So these kind of received and calcified, unexamined religious notions. Like what's forgiveness? We have a lot of these things that are complicated, but that we sort of get them in this kind of ossified package. And then we kind of are acting out of those ossified ideas without kind of A, realizing where they come from, and B, interrogating them. Like, is it helpful to think of forgiveness in XYZ way, or is it not? And in some ways, I think the literature that we thought about, or that I thought about in the series, I was also picking things that I thought offered alternatives sometimes to the calcified narrative. The Paul Ricoeur refers to it, the Christian pattern, this sort of like static, unmoving thing that is received, with which we have no dialogue, that never moves, and that isn't
Same
dynamic.
as the black church is supposedly this stable, narrow
monolithic.
entity, and you're going to complicate it with the novel. And then
Exactly.
You did it with the essay series all over again.
Okay, I think, to me, all of this, and it is what's useful about religious idiom and religious thought, is that it's dialogic, right? Like it isn't, we are often, by the sort of forces that are the loudest in Christianity these days, we're sort of told that these things are static, are a bludgeon, these kinds of things, but in reality, all of this stuff is very much open for and encouraging of dialogue, right? Like it's, the Bible, for example, is not a dead document. It is a living, thriving piece of literature, whether you take it literally or not. I do not. My religious background was that, but I certainly am not of that background any longer. But even if I were to approach the Bible as a piece of literature metaphorically, there's so much there, and there's so much to kind of be in conversation with. And so I also sort of wanted to think about how audiences that might have read the series, but also younger people, could have a way to become reintroduced to certain kinds of vocabulary and ideas that might be, quote unquote, falling out of the culture, or that we say are falling out of the culture, even though they're not. I mean, we could look at any number of headlines from the last couple of months, and we would find all sorts of things that are drawing on religious ideas, very often in pretty nasty ways. But if we don't even know what that stuff is, how do we think about it? How do we combat it? What do we do with it?
Well, the series totally works. In a different age, it would be a 4-chapter book sold next to the cash register, everywhere from St. Mark's Books to the Seabury bookstore. But as it is, it's beautifully illustrated on the Times site. It's so high-pitched, it's majestic. It's the brainiest thing I've read in the New York Times in years. And you got away with so much just by claiming it. And it just, the account of forgiveness as kind of willingness to live with this unfixable failure instead of just wiping clean to the slate. It's really rich and complicated. You mentioned when we were, and we'll go to questions in a moment, but my last question for you is, you mentioned outside that you would like to teach some sort of course based on that series, but meanwhile you're taking some sort of courses. You were enrolled in Union Theological Seminary. You're teaching over on the east side at Hunter, and then you're studying on the west side up at Union. What led you there, and what are you up to at Union?
So I'm studying theology very slowly. I'm never going to be finished Union. I make a joke that
Many people are in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like me and the rest of them will all get our MDiv in 2042. But just because life is busy, they've been very kind in letting me slowly move through. But
you do have a few other things that you're doing.
They've been very nice. But yeah, exactly. They've been very nice to me about that. But I think I wanted to go for a long time. I mean, these ideas we've mentioned, I come from this very kind of intensely Black evangelical background. My grandparents were evangelicals. My mother was as well. She would call herself that, but essentially, in a certain sense, was. And so I, like many people, when I got to my teens, I kind of rejected that belief system, and I stopped going to church very obnoxiously, I might add, by I would kind of like sit in the pew. I couldn't not go to church, so I would be like, fine, I'll go to church, and so I would sit in the pew.
Reading Camus or something.
No, it was worse. I would sit there, and the pastor would say something, and I'd be like, ugh, it's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. Like, and I mean, it's just like the rude, And finally, my mother was like, "Okay, just it's fine. You don't have to go anymore." So I stopped, and then I spent a fairly long period of time, like through my teens and into my early 20s, trying to be sophisticated. Like I met all these middle-class white people, and I was like, "Oh, if you can be sophisticated, you don't have to believe in God." I was trying to do that, but it didn't really stick. I was saying to somebody the other day, I'd feel like, "Oh yes, these religious people, they're sheep and this and that, and then someone would just say something like, "Yeah, there's no God," and I'd be like, "Well, wait a minute," so it didn't really completely, it didn't totally stick. In any case, so as the years went on, I just found myself always drawn to, much of my reading would be somewhat theological in nature. The fiction that I read, I read fiction pretty widely, but would often have these kinds of religious undercurrents. And what I came to understand is that, and it took a long time, but it's, what I came to understand is that perhaps the answers that my church tradition offered about the sort of big things about being alive, suffering and evil and all of these sorts of things, that the answers that were offered in that context were not answers that I believe per se, or at all in many cases, but the nature of the questions and the ways in which the questions about existence and what a human being is, and what we owe each other, and what a society ought to look like, and what pain is, and what grief is, and what suffering is. The nature of the ways in which those questions were asked resonated and resonates with me very, very deeply. And so once I kind of understood that, and understood also the other piece of it for me is this piece about belief, as in the title of the Time series. I'm very interested, I realized, in belief, like what it does for people, what it has done for people, what it did for my grandparents, what it did for my mother. What does it mean to believe? Like, what is faith? Even if the object of that belief is very mysterious to me. I sort of make a joke that I'm like, well, yeah, I guess, I believe there's a God, but I don't know what it does or what it's doing, like that's not for me. It's above my pay grade. But belief in something, and religious belief has been so transformative for, centuries and centuries and millennia of people. And I sort of began to think to myself, well, gosh, who do I think I am if my grandparents, who were born they're passed away now, of course, but who were born in Virginia in 1910 and 1908, if these people believe, and this has kept them in part alive, who am I, to go, ugh, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, if anybody knows what they're talking about, it's a couple of black people born in 1910 and 1908, right, in Virginia. So I began to kind of be like, I need to re-understand what it was that I'm dismissing. And so in a certain sense, what I'm doing at Union and what I'm doing, I think, in these books, and what I hope to keep on doing, is to begin to understand my own questions about the tradition in which I was raised, and to begin to understand its nuances much more clearly, and to begin to sort of add my own questions to that inquiry. And that's basically, I think that's what I'm doing at Union. I'm sort of like, what is this thing that is belief? What is it? And what are the sort of stories that grow? I'm a fiction writer. And so in many ways, to me, theology is these kind of, are stories that grow up around this sacred central concern. So all of that is of deep interest and meaning to me, and beauty.
Keep on doing it by all means. I mean, those are the questions of a number of people in this room, I'm sure. So let's hear your questions. Yes.
Thank you for this. It was really enjoyable.
Mike's coming your way.
Thank you for this. It was really enjoyable. I had a question about your journey to writing this book. You mentioned that it was challenging and it took 10 years. So I was wondering what brought you back to it and compelled you to finish it.
An answer occurs to me that has language in it that's inappropriate for this room. I'll try to. A friend of mine, I was saying, and this really is the answer to your question, even though it's sort of a funny story. So a friend of mine who is a poet finished a book a couple of years ago, and then was sort of lamenting the fact that he was having some trouble kind of getting started again with new book. And I was also saying, well, you know, I don't know, I think maybe I have an idea, but... And then he says to me, he was like, you better be careful, because the problem with the book is, once you start that MFer, you got to finish it. And that, in fact, is the whole story of how this book got written. That's basically, like, once you start, you got to finish. I don't know why. I don't know why that. It's because it certainly isn't, maybe it's stupidity, I don't know. You know, it's, or like a character flaw, probably. But there is something about, once you really are like, I've begun this thing, you just, you know, you kind of can't walk away. And I'm not exactly sure why, but you kind of can't. And so I couldn't, so I just kind of kept going back, though it was frustrating and slow and really infuriating, actually. But, you know.
Thank you. I echo the thanks that were just given. I have to ask you about those chapters in the homeless shelter, the horrible, horrible homeless shelter. Now, I'm going to assume you have not spent much time in a homeless shelter. And so you could read about such places. There is a sociological literature. But how did you make those come alive with such enormous detail, such poignancy, such deep emotion?
Well, you would be wrong for assuming that I have never spent any time in a homeless shelter. I have. So there's that, as a very young, like a kid. So there's that. But I don't think, you know, I'm always hesitant to make it seem as though experience translates one-to-one into artistic expression, because it doesn't. And in fact, one of the very difficult things about this book is that I think a lot of times, you know, individual experience, particularly of the difficult variety, kind of imprints itself on you in almost sort of static ways. If you speak to people, now I'm not talking about myself, but sometimes if you speak to people who've had kind of certain kinds of trauma, they'll talk about remembering things almost as though they were snapshots instead of as like dynamic memories. Or if they're dynamic memories, they're isolated. But that, of course, isn't the stuff of art, right? Like art has to, and literature in particular, like it has to move. Its enemy is stasis. And so a lot of the sort of initial stages of this book were an attempt to make dynamic whatever and move beyond whatever snapshots I had in my head that were these sort of like ossified little bits of memory that in fact could never be story, that could never be narrative, that couldn't translate into an experience that anyone else could access, right? Because that's the other point of literature, right? Like you have to be able to enter. So that was a big part of it. And honestly, you know, too, it's like you sort of, there's things that you forget or you don't remember or you misremember. So, you know, I would do things like go on Google and like look at homeless shelters. Like, you know what I mean? I mean, it sounds so crass, but like, you know, you sort of have to do those things as well. So that, because the important thing, I think, unless you're writing a memoir or something, is that you're not translating your own experience directly. You're it's almost as though I'm giving my experience to these other people, the other people being Ava and Toussaint and whoever, like they, and in that translation, it becomes not mine anymore. Like it has to be theirs. It can't be mine. So that kind of process, in fact, was lengthy. It was painful as well, but also really like a lengthy process.
I'm learning just listening to you speak, and I just finished rereading the novel yesterday, but I'm going to, I think, look at those passages again tomorrow morning and look at them in a new way. We have a reception outside where we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to our co-sponsors. Thanks to Joe Ferrara. And just thanks again for joining us.
It was
I'm so
my
glad
great
you're
pleasure.
here.
Thank you.